All right. Welcome everyone to this Education for All Town Hall. We're going to discuss some really awesome things in relation to the voucher system in Florida and beyond. We'll touch on, again, the voucher system in Florida, the tie between the separation of church and state, the impact that school vouchers have on students and communities. And then we'd love to hear from you all about your school experiences in both Florida and beyond, or experiences with vouchers. I'd first like to introduce our speakers that are here tonight. We can start with Nik Nartowicz. He is the State Policy Counsel at AU for the separation of church and state, and he joined AU in 2017. In his role, he tracks and analyzes state legislation that affects church-state separation and religious liberty. He helps to draft letters to legislators and works with allies to defeat bills that undermine religious freedom. He joined AU after working for 2 years in DC with Mayor Bowser in the Office of Federal and Regional Affairs. And he worked with Congress, federal agencies, and DC's priorities in judiciary, legal, public safety, LGBTQ plus issues, and technology issues. He also helped to lead a successful statehood referendum in 2016 in DC. And tying him back to Florida, he actually lived in Esmeralda for just over a year when he was in high school, where he attended Coral Shores High School. So warm welcome to Nik. Thank you for being here tonight. And our other speaker is Karen Perez. She's elected to the Hillsborough County School Board in 2018 to represent District 6. She's one of the 7 members responsible for making policy decisions and overseeing a budget of $3.3 billion for the 7th largest school district in the nation. She holds a master's in social work and is a licensed clinical social worker in Florida and New York. She currently works with patients and families at the James A. Haley Veterans Hospital, but also operates her private practice, Embracing Changes Center for Wellness. She sits on the board for the Federation of Families, the Veterans Transportation Service, Board of Directors, and the Lesbian, Gay, Bisexual, Transgender, Questioning, and Straight Allies Committee. Again, thank you, Ms. Perez, for also being here tonight. Right. And now we're actually going to move into Ms. Perez. We're going to have her discuss, the voucher system in Florida and her experiences with that. So if you'd like to.
It would help if I got off mute. So the voucher system in the state of Florida is a government-funded scholarship that allows public school students to attend private schools or a school of their choice. So what it does is it provides funding directly to the families, and it doesn't go to the school, instead of the district schools. So so the families can apply directly to the schools with that funding, with their tuition costs paid for, these schools of their choice. And it also, the families also can apply for McKay scholarships for students with disabilities, that these schools will receive those fundings as well. For any school that the parents decide or deem that the student will benefit from.
Awesome. I just had some more questions that I can ask you during this section of the presentation. So during your term, how's the development of school vouchers in Florida happened? Both, I know you also have a background in kind of education and in social work. So what have you sort of seen as the progression of the voucher system in Florida?
Well, I've noticed that that the funding that comes to the public schools that really help our schools and our students then get divided out, to the students to move. So the amount that each student gets towards these vouchers are $7,000 a year, for the students to be able to go into these schools. But the issue is that there is no accountability when it comes to these vouchers. We have no idea, what the school's performance is about, what, because the money follows the student, but the accountability does not. Accountability does, however, stay with the public schools. So, the federal government follows the public schools, what the public schools are doing, how, the teachers are certified in our public schools, but although the vouchers follow the students, accountability does not follow those vouchers or the money that's being spent, where those vouchers are being, turned into, or, being utilized with our students. So very two different discussions, when it comes to what our students are learning, how they're learning, and because that education that money is funding is following your student for the rest of their life. Education is the foundation of our students, future. And so when we're putting money into a voucher program, when we're really looking at what accountability goes behind the vouchers, we need to find out and look at the institutions that this money is going into. What students look like that are able to utilize these vouchers, and what these students are learning in those institutions.
Wonderful, wonderful answer. And I wanted to ask, kind of specific to your role as a Hillsborough County School Board member, like what is your what can you do in your role to sort of promote, or not promote voter vouchers, but to kind of take a stand against them? And in your position, what can you do to kind of, disavow vouchers?
So, for the families who are listening, when this is where the voucher programs truly lends to the haves and have-nots. When a parent comes to a school or the organization and says, I want to have my child participate in the voucher program, what ends up being the responsibility of the parent is that you receive a voucher, but then it's your responsibility to get a student to that school, the school that you choose. Now, there's a lot of parents whose children would probably love to go to a private school, who would possibly want to have their child educated in a private school, but cannot afford to transport that child to those private schools. So you start seeing that disparity right there. And then some of the private schools will take that $7,000, but then there's an additional amount of tuition that the parent has to pay. So those vouchers are not the end all be all. A lot of those vouchers still have to be cushioned with additional dollars, so it depends on what school you select, where you want to send your child, and your ability to get that child to that school. So there's still those vouchers create a selection process that is not fair, neither to the group of participants in the voucher program or to the parents who want to participate in that voucher program.
Thank you. And my last kind of question for this section is, what do you think the future of public education looks like in Florida? Where do you see vouchers getting expanded? Do you see them declining? Do you see them kind of staying where they're at? What does the future of public education look like in Florida?
Well, like I just mentioned, we have that line, especially right now with the economy, that line between the haves and have-nots is increasingly getting larger and larger. With our students who really need access to public school. I went to public school, and public school was fantastic. We didn't have charter schools back then. Everybody participated in the public school system, except for those who really have the money to send their children to a private institution. For us, for me, the public school was incredible. It prepared me for my next step into higher education, which is college. And right now, that our public schools continue to prepare our students. It equalizes the learning process. It allows our students to have a window into, the different cultures that are surrounding them here in Hillsborough County. As we look, as the charter schools keep overtaking the funding for the public schools, as the voucher programs continue, it continues to dwindle down the funding that is going into our public schools. And if that continues, it's really going to hurt our children that attend public schools. It really is. And right now, I'm just hoping that the public school funding continues in order to maintain that equalization of education for all our children. Because that's what, first of all, this country is built on, number one. But number two, it maintains that stability of our communities, and it maintains that stability of allowing our students, no matter where they come from, to be able to have access to that education that they need and they require.
Thank you so much, School Board Member Perez. I see some wonderful questions in the chat, and we will definitely address every single one of them in our Q&A portion. For now, I'd love to move it on to Nik to discuss sort of this connection between vouchers and the separation of church and state.
Yes, so first, thank you, Vicki, for putting this on, and thanks to everyone for being here and watching this today. So there are a lot of reasons that one should oppose vouchers and that AU opposes vouchers, primarily among those that vouchers don't actually work. They don't improve student educational outcomes. They lack important accountability measures, which Councilmember Perez had mentioned, and there's a litany of lists. But one of the reasons that AU works on them, and actually AU was founded primarily to oppose private school vouchers, is because they are a church-state separation issue. Our nation was founded on the principle that government aid for religion harms both the taxpayer and religion. It violates the religious conscience of the taxpayers because it coerces them to fund religion, and it endangers religion by entangling it with the state. So I'm going to talk about those, I'll break them down a little bit each so we can get into it a little bit more. So it's a fundamental principle of religious freedom that the government should not compel anyone to pay for someone else's religious education or religion. That's a bedrock concept of our country. But private school vouchers send money to private religious schools in violation of this core protection. The ideal that you shouldn't pay for someone's religious education is actually encompassed in 47 state constitutions. 47 states have some version of what's called the no aid clause in their constitutions. And many of those no aid clauses were motivated by a desire to keep public funds in public schools. No aid clauses actually vary from state to state. Some are broad, which bar taxpayer funds from being used to support any religious institution or activity. So those will say something like no state funding can be used to support any minister or ministry or religious institution. The language varies, but you see trends across the different states. While others are more limited and actually explicitly bar the use of taxpayer support for religious education. And they will say specifically, no funding can go towards any denomination, school controlled by a denomination or something like that. So no aid clauses, again, protect both religion and government because they prevent one from controlling the other. And it allows religious diversity in America to flourish because it lets lots of different people with lots of different religious views exist, have their schools, and not have government regulation. They guarantee that each person can decide which religion to support, if any, without government coercion or interference. And they uphold the autonomy of these religious institutions by ensuring houses of worship don't become dependent on government money and therefore subjected to further government oversight. And some of these state no aid clauses actually predate the US Constitution. One example is actually New Jersey. Their state constitution was written in 1776, and that had a no aid clause. So that In fact, I actually don't know the exact date, so I don't know if it predates the Declaration of Independence, but the Constitution wasn't written until 1789, so it predates it by 13 years. And other states have added no aid clauses to their constitutions throughout the 1800s, as obviously as more states join the Union, they would have them. And even states that have had them for a long time have reaffirmed them when they've had constitutional conventions in the 20th century. So there have been states that have had constitutional conventions. I actually don't know the most recent one, but I know there were some in the 70s and the 80s where voters again voted and said, yes, we want to maintain this no aid provision in our constitution and protect public funding for public schools. So the other side of it that I mentioned is religious interference, the idea that private school vouchers actually open up religious schools to regulation by the state. If a religious institution and a religious school is separate from the state and it's paid for by tuition or donations from the church or church members, then the school is free to operate as it sees fit. But once a school accepts government funding, it comes with conditions attached, as it should, as all government funding should come with conditions attached. So this would open up those religious schools to things like audits, other control, and interference. Because if a religious school accepts taxpayer funds, the taxpayers should get to know how that money is spent, that it's being used properly, that the students who are there actually attending the school, that it's providing a quality education, that it actually is improving student test scores, if that's the concept behind it. So again, it comes with all these strings attached. Private school vouchers also put religious schools in the risk of being basically part of the political debate, because you start having battles over whether or not vouchers should exist at all. Should we be paying for private school vouchers? What does that regulation look like? What does the accountability look like? What do admission standards look like at schools? What do the curriculum look like? What are the hiring practices? All of these things that religious schools, if they didn't take this funding, would not have these inquiries. But again, because it's providing state money, those are conditions that attach. It's the same things we ask of our public schools. So if we're giving funding to our public schools, any money that goes to any other schools, we should be asking the same questions. Again, so that's kind of a broad issue, but why is it something that AU cares about? Because private school vouchers primarily fund religious schools. When that happens, so when a school accepts a voucher, you could, in theory, have a voucher and say, we're going to pay not for religious education. But for many private religious schools, they're unable or unwilling to separate out the religious components of the education from what they offer in their academic programs. A lot of you might learn different social studies curriculum. You might have a different history class than is in the state standards because you are a religious school. You are attempting to teach your curriculum from a religious perspective. So it's impossible to prevent a publicly funded voucher from paying for religious activities and education when that happens, because inevitably, when you're at a religious school, there are going to be some religious activities that happen if it's paying for that tuition. And that conflicts with the principle I mentioned earlier of religious freedom, that the government shouldn't compel someone to pay for someone else's religious education, whether you agree with it or not. Even if you are the same denomination, you might be a Baptist, or you might be a Christian and Baptist and not want to pay for someone who's Methodist. You might be a Baptist who goes to a slightly different church that has a different school, that has pastors with different views, and you don't want to pay for that pastor's other views. You should be forced to pay for a religion which you disagree or even agree 99% of the way and don't fully agree with, and therefore don't want to pay for. And so again, parents have the right to choose a religious education for their children. They have that ability now. They can send them to private religious schools, but they can't insist that taxpayers pay for it. And just so you get a concept of what that actually looks like in practice, in Arizona, for example, they spend more than $200 million a year of their voucher program money goes to religious schools. In Florida, in 2019, 80% of voucher students were enrolled in religious schools. In 2019, there was one Indiana voucher program where 99.4% of students went to religious schools. And in Kansas, for the 2016-2017 school year, every single student who used a voucher attended either a Catholic or a non-denominational Christian school. And actually, New Hampshire passed a new voucher program, not this year, but the previous year. So it actually took effect this past school, the 2021-22 school year. And a report there found that small private schools across the state received the majority of the education, totaling more than 62% of the funding, and many of them were Christian schools. And in fact, all but two families. So another issue with that actually as well, in New Hampshire specifically, all but 2 of the families who applied for the funding to go to private schools already attended private schools. So all this voucher did was subsidize the choice to go to private school that parents had already made. So that's, again, right, the concept is we should not be funding other people's religious education. And the last piece I want to hit on is discrimination. So public schools are open to and must serve all students. Any student who lives in the district can go, must be accepted. It doesn't matter what their economic status is, et cetera, et cetera. Private schools, however, can and do deny students admission or expel them because of their religion, sexual orientation, gender identity, academic abilities, disciplinary history, disability, or even ability to pay tuition. And private schools don't have to abide by the same civil rights, or do not abide by the same civil rights laws that apply to public schools. And that includes things like federal laws that protect students with disabilities and actually ensure that students with disabilities get a quality education. So this type of discrimination is particularly difficult for LGBTQ students and families when it comes to private religious schools, because they can deny religion, or they can deny admission or expel a student if they find out that that student is LGBTQ, or if they find out that their parent is, or whatever it is. They can say, they can come up with some reason to say, oh, you have an LGBTQ family, therefore we're denying you admission to the school, or again, expelling you, that type of thing. And specifically, a lot of private schools actually actively teach an anti-LGBTQ curriculum and promote conversion therapy, which is of course harmful for LGBTQ students. And in Florida specifically, a 2019 investigation found that of 156 private schools that had anti-LGBTQ views, educated more than 20,000 students using more than $129 million in state-funded vouchers. So more than $100 million went to discriminatory schools that refuse to accept or admit or teach LGBTQ students with taxpayer funding. But it doesn't just stop at students, because private religious schools can also discriminate against their employees. They can claim an exemption from employment non-discrimination provisions under Title VII of the Civil Rights Act and the ministerial exception. And in fact, private religious schools have used religion as a basis to fire teachers for their reproductive health choices, which includes whether it's to have an abortion or you are a single parent, you're a single mother who's pregnant, they can fire you for that. They can have refused to hire a teacher because of the belief that a mother should stay in the home with her children, and have fired teachers for being in same-sex marriages. And we actually represent a teacher right now who was fired for teaching a lesson on basically the history of race in the United States. And the school is claiming a religious exemption to be able to fire that teacher. And so of course, another fundamental principle of religious freedom is that taxpayer funding should never be used to pay for discrimination against a student or an employee because of who they are. So that is my long-winded explanation of why it is a church-state issue and we should all care about this.
Thank you so much, Nick. I think you pulling in, obviously we are on our 6th day of Pride Month. And so I think that's a really important conversation, as both of you have some background in representing and talking about queer issues, which kind of opens it into our next point about discussing the impact of school vouchers on students and communities. So one of these things, or at least prior to kind of my research in this area, I was wondering, like, school vouchers, when we say public funding, how do they move with the student? I know we talked about like the $7,000, at least in Florida. I know that might vary from state to state, but when a student leaves public school to enter a voucher program, what exactly, I guess, maybe a little more of an explanation on that point, if either of you can provide one.
So what happens is that, say for instance, the school kicks the student out, expels, or the student moves, that school is not obligated to repay that money back. Actually, that money stays with the school. So let's say, for instance, it's not working out where the student goes with the voucher, and he decides to come back to public school. So we have to take on that student at no cost to the public school where the voucher is, they're keeping that money. And that has happened time and time and time again. We have had students return to us from private schools, from charter schools with their vouchers. And, and they haven't been into schools very long either, but the money does not follow them back. So it's at a loss. It's at a great loss to the public schools. The voucher system has been a tremendous loss financially to the public schools, and it affects all the students. Because then when you're looking even at 100 or 200 students, that's a lot of financial loss to the public schools. Then the other students have to take on.
Yeah, and I'll add, so it's not just the loss of state funding, but the federal government provides a lot of funding to states based on enrollment. And so if you're losing those students to private schools, you're not getting that federal piece of the funding anymore at some point. I don't know the specifics of all the Florida programs and how, but that you will lose that eventually, right? They're not there. And there are a lot of fixed costs. So say, forget 100 students, say you lose 50 students, you're a K through or first through sixth grade school, and you lose 50 students. So that's about 10 students across each grade. That's a lot of overall money, but you probably can't fire any teachers because that's only 10 students per grade. So you've got, if you have, 50 students, yeah, you have slightly smaller classes, but you don't have fewer teacher costs, which means all of the costs are associated with that. You aren't in a smaller building. It's not suddenly cheaper to cool the building and have the AC on. It's not cheaper to keep the lights on. All of those costs are fixed, but now you have taken out a few students from each class and lost that revenue without losing any actual costs. So there can actually, sometimes even losing a few people is worse than losing a lot because, no one wants to fire a teacher. But if you lose enough, or you can say, okay, we used to have 5 teachers in this grade and now we can have 4, you actually are saving some costs. But if you just lose a few across a large population, you're hurt even more.
And to Nik's point, not only federal, but also, our local tax allocations also we lose. So we lose all the way across, and to Nik's point, if we can't fund, we end up losing valuable teachers that help educate all our students. And then when those students come back, the teachers have moved on, then we have a shortage for the teachers, and we don't have the allocations to pay them. It's a ripple effect that happens because of these vouchers that are, it's a money game, but that it's affecting our most vulnerable population, which is our students.
Thank you both for that answer. I thought it was very important to kind of emphasize the extra stress that private school vouchers and that sort of those moves do put on public schools and the public school system. Again, you lose a student, you're losing kind of all across the board. So thank you for that answer. And we've already sort of touched on it, but I wanted to kind of bring it up again, is the impact of these, discriminatory practices that are available. And I actually had kind of a point of question a little bit, but not quite in the Q&A. Sort of when we talk about, especially charter schools who kind of receive some public funding, but also don't have that public the administrative part of it, or accountability portion, where does that fall in between fully public or fully private? If you could answer that.
Well, those charter schools, again, the teachers don't have to be certified. They go through a lot of administration changes. There's no stability in those schools. And, one of the things, and accountability, and one of the things in the public schools that we do have, is that stability. We have teachers that have been in our system. I celebrated one just recently who's been in the school system in Hillsborough County for 50 years. Where do you get a teacher who stays in a school system 50 years? I don't think very many places. We have teachers who've been with us for 30, 40 years. In the charter schools, there's just a constant moving, even with the leadership. We've had a couple of charter schools who've had, 3 or 4 principals in just 1 year. So that lack of stability, it affects not just the students, but their learning, their engagement. When you don't know who you're running to, or who you're talking to, or who your leadership is, it destabilizes that school. But with that said, the charter schools do not require to have the certification, the teachers certified, over those classrooms. So those children are not learning the same things that our children in public schools are learning. And that for me bothers me. Recently I had a person from DCF who went to conduct an assessment on a student in a charter school and came back and let me know that, the classroom was very filthy, that, the bathrooms were not clean, that the teachers themselves were trying to manage the classroom and, the upkeep of the school at the same time. So there's just a very different environment as opposed to the schools, the public schools and those charter schools. But we in the public schools cannot go and enforce, how we lead in the public schools and those charter schools. They're very separate entities. They have separate boards of leadership, and our enforcement that we put on the public schools are not the same that they do in the charter schools.
Thank you. And with that, just because I know we had a bit of a time crunch on starting, I wanted to move into kind of opening it up to those in the audience to sort of share their experiences with private or public schools, whether or not they were involved in vouchers or the voucher system. So if anyone would like to speak, they can raise their hand, and we can allow you to do that. So trying to see if anyone is wanting to. I can always go first with my own personal experiences, which is what I'll do. So I myself am a public school product from Florida, Jacksonville, Florida, so not quite your county, Ms. Perez, but I was someone who, I think one of the kind of biggest issues, at least that I've heard, is that like people think that, well, private schools are inherently kind of better than public schools because you have to pay more for them, which means they might be paying more, or like there might be more amenities. But as someone who kind of went through, I was part of the magnet program, which is a program within public schools that promotes school choice and like promotes kind of different options than just where you're zoned, because that quite wasn't the education that my parents wanted for me at the time. I think that, programs like that, the magnet program, I know that there's probably a different name for it in other states, kind of does still allow for some level of school choice within the public school system without having it completely, without it, again, with that accountability, because these are still public schools that still have to, not discriminate. You look at some of the genuine sort of like racial makeups of a lot of schools, and they're not private schools, and a lot of them are not very diverse. So that's, one way that I kind of had my experience, and public school has been very kind to me and very helpful to me. And I think that there's just so many other options than to, apply for a voucher or try and move out of that. We actually do have one attendee that would like to speak. Lydia Gebrsadek, if you'd like to, I'll allow you to talk. All right.
All right. Hello, I'm Lydia, product of public school. But being a queer person and having conversations with other people in regards to their school backgrounds, public or private. I personally have a friend who went to a private school, religious affiliated, and with that education and that background was very damaging for them, as they were subjected to a lot of teaching styles and a lot of things that were just went against their very, went against them as a person, and completely in regards to like signing codes of conduct that to denounce their queerness, and learning very little diversity in terms of like other queer people, no sexual education in terms of queerness, and then very little for straight people. So I kind of see both sides, coming from a public school and learning having a little bit of sexual education in terms of queerness and for straight people, but I can see how damaging it is for I can see how damaging it is for people going from private schools and having that religious aspect and being affected by that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lydia, for speaking. I also have another student or person, Monica Smith, that would like to talk, so I'm going to allow her to speak.
Hello, I'm Monica, and I'm a product of a religious micro private school. So especially coming to college, so I'm also from Jacksonville, Florida, and I go to school in Tampa. And comparing my experience to other people in my classes, I've truly understood the gap I received in my education. My school did oftentimes put religion over education. So in my classes, there were large gaps between, like, my graduating class was 13, and the top 5% of my class and the top 5% should have never been placed in a classroom together. It deeply hurt the bottom half of my class because they were forced to compete with students who should have been in honors programs at a public school, while they should have been in courses that should have helped their development. And instead, it just focused on, using religion in their life to fulfill those educational gaps. And now, like 4 years out from my graduation, I really see the differences in those of us that have completed degrees. A lot of my graduating class is having to take extra years to complete their college degrees. And I know that they're capable people, and it's not truly their fault that they weren't given the foundation they needed throughout elementary, middle, and high school, because it was a K through 12 school. And by the time you reach college, it was very difficult to undo a lot of that damage, since also it took a long time for me to realize how lacking my education was. No one wants to sit down and go, yeah, I went to a bad school. It's kind of embarrassing to sit there and realize you're someone that doesn't know what's going on. And the voucher system, I think, deeply impacts this, because most parents and most students, by the time they've graduated from these systems, don't know where to go to get the help they need to re-supplement their education. Those are just some points I wanted to bring up. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Monica, for speaking. I think both of you touched on some very important issues with the voucher system and kind of issues with private schools, kind of what Nik was mentioning. It's almost impossible to, it is impossible to separate the religious from the religious school. You can't use this public funding. There is just no separation. And I think your point, Monica, about how that can be harmful, and kind of touching on everyone, I guess. Member Perez talked about this equalizing of education and how each student deserves a quality education. I think that's something that everyone can agree on. And having classes that small can obviously pose a problem. When you have people at different kind of developmental stages, you are either harming against each other that bottom half of the class, or you're harming that top half of the class from kind of reaching their potential. I think that's an important point, that public schools do allow for that nuance and allow for kind of development for everyone in a way that private schools, one, may not have the ability to, or just do not. That was really wonderful. I was wondering, is there anyone else that would like to speak? I'm not sure if I see any more hands. I see Karen. Perez, do you want to say something?
I did. I wanted to share my daughter, came out when she was 13 that she was gay. And what was incredible about the public school is that they surrounded her with a lot of support. And she's actually a financial influencer up on Wall Street right now. And I think because of the experience she had in public school, because she was surrounded by such incredible support, first, a parent that supported her, but also teachers in the public school that supported her as well. I think that helped her, create the person that she is today. I shudder to think, had she been in a private institution who stifled her voice and stifled the person who she, who she was and who she is, what type of individual she would have ended up to be. And that's why I say the public schools just encourage that student individuality, and don't shame students out of who they are. And that's why with the voucher program, it does worry me, especially when those schools are able to shut down that child and in the most fragile time of their life, and when they're starting to develop into the person who they are.
Thank you so much for sharing that. I think that's a very important part, because I know at least in Jacksonville, there are a couple of schools. Again, you talk to a lot of people, again, in college, and you're able to share a lot of experiences. And, I know people who had to sign codes of conduct promising that they were not queer. And kind of it almost feels crazy because I'm in the same city as them. We went to school together, but completely different world when you step into the private school realm. So it's very shocking, and I agree, it can be very intense. And we have one more person that would like to speak, Lauren Canaday.
Hi, everyone. I just want to add in with my own personal story of being in the public school system. I have a little bit of a different experience, since I had experience going to a middle school that was in the magnet program. And then I transferred going into my own neighborhood public funded school. So both very diverse, and I am thankful for my experience, but actually I'm an early elementary school student teacher. And I have had experience teaching in a religious funded early childhood center. So I realized quickly that the curriculum is very different from my own experience. Already at this age, I had students that were 3 years old, 4 years old, and 5 years old. And the religious curriculum we had to teach was very heavy. And there's a lot of things that weren't focused on for these children's young developments that definitely should have been prioritized. And I could just see how unaware the teachers there were about a lot of subjects, and how religion was just overly taking over the curriculum. And that was a very different experience that I had when I had my own public education. And I think that's a bit of largely a concern for these young students that are growing up in these private schools. So I just wanted to make that point as well.
Thank you so much, Lauren. I think that's a very unique perspective, as we've again heard from a lot, everyone as a student, but also as a future teacher. I think that's a very important portion, and very important to see, and that does raise concern for you. And I think it raises concern for a lot of teachers and a lot of people that are or want to enter the education field, whether or not they will be able to sort of manage in this kind of workforce. So I really do appreciate that perspective. And with that, we might run over a little bit of time, but we do have a lot of questions. I'm first going to ask the questions in the chat, and then we had some questions that were sent in through our registration form. So we're going to get started with that. All right, starting with the first question from Fred Bond, I think. Do the schools have to meet accreditation standards? I'm assuming this was about either charter or private schools. What are sort of the standards that they need to meet in order to be a functioning school?
So I will say it depends on the state. In Florida, they don't have to be accredited. And there was one, there have been some amazing journalists who've done really great studies about the various voucher programs in DC that I cite all the time in my letters. And I know that of the 2,100 schools that take vouchers in Florida, 70% were unaccredited as of article was written in 2021, it looks like. But they also are like there are other accountability standards that schools have to meet that they don't. Again, another one of these investigations found that voucher schools had falsified fire safety and health records, had hired staff with criminal convictions despite limitations on the program, and had held classes in dangerous buildings. So even kind of standard building requirements are not always met by these voucher schools sometimes.
And also IEPs, they don't follow IEP protocols for their students. As a matter of fact, when we go through to do their accreditations, we have found that there's no IEPs in the students' records at all. They haven't, updated anything in the students' records. So
very shocking to kind of hear those numbers. Obviously, you hear experiences, but having them quantified like that is really shocking. We had another question from Bob Kester. I think that this sort of has been answered. So public money is given to help pay for private, even religious education, which we talked about. There's no, the money follows the student, but the accountability does not. So we can continue. Fred Rome had another question about, sounds like a loophole for bringing segregation back. How many vouchers are handed out each year? I'm not sure if you meant, for Florida or for beyond, but I know that there's a few voucher programs. Again, Member Perez mentioned programs for students with disabilities. I also know that we do have a HOPE scholarship voucher program here in Florida, which is a bullying/harassment voucher program, which I have a question for you guys about a little later. I'm not sure, but again, in theory, then a school, like as we talked about, the civil rights that apply to public schools do not apply to private/religious. So does that mean that a private or religious school could deny based on race and other things? I'm not sure if we can answer.
So I will say, I don't know the number of vouchers that get handed out in Florida each year, but I think there are 5 total programs right now. Although this legislature passed a bill last year that combined some of them. I don't remember the exact numbers, but I do know that the state spends more money on vouchers than any other state in the union. They spend more than $1.3 billion, which is a crazy amount of money. To the segregation piece, so I'm not going to pretend like segregation has been solved in public schools since Brown v. Board of Education. It has not, and there are lots of reasons that schools remain segregated today in a de facto way, to use a lawyer word. But that also happens in vouchers, and in fact, that's a large part of the reason vouchers became a thing. After Brown v. Board of Education, a lot of southern states decided we don't actually want to integrate our schools, and so we're going to create voucher programs. There was one school district in Virginia that shut down for years and just gave out vouchers. And so they would create segregation academies, which were often religious schools that popped up. And so they'd be all white schools. so that you could send your student to an all-white school and get public funding without actually having to go to public school. So that is kind of issue number one, is that they are rooted in segregation. That's where they come from. But if you look at a lot of the language that was used then, it's the same language that people use to talk about vouchers now, that like you can find, I wish I had pulled up the tweet beforehand. I think I tweeted this, but someone found an article about vouchers in like the 60s and the 50s and 60s. And literally it's like, it's not about racism. It's about, you know, giving your parents a choice, and you just want to have the money follow the student. And it's all the same language. And it's very clearly, it was about sending your student to an all-white school then, and it's the same language that's used now. And in fact, the reality is that a lot of vouchers make segregation worse in a lot of ways. There was a recent article about vouchers in, I'm forgetting if it was Minnesota or Wisconsin, but that something like it, like there was one town where the racial breakdown of the town was like 70% white, 20% black, and whatever the you know, other races for the rest of it. But like the voucher program was like 90% white students, and so that there are a lot of those discrepancies in programs throughout the country.
And remember, I mentioned in the beginning that it creates the gap between the haves and have-nots, because a lot of the parents who utilize the voucher program are parents who have the transportation to get their students to these schools. And a lot of parents who are of color, Black or brown, are not able, they're, you know, low income, you know, socioeconomically disadvantaged, as opposed to, you know, parents of other cultures who are able to make a little bit more money, over 100,000 a year, or, you know, 170,000 a year, as opposed to parents who are on welfare or depend on the state or are in low-paying jobs, who probably catch a bus to get to work themselves or have to leave early to get to work. We used to have, you know, in the 80s, that term latchkey kids. I'm not sure what the term is now, but where the kids get themselves up and get themselves to the bus, you know, when the parent has to leave for work, you know, prior to the kid waking up. But, you know, those parents are not, you know, well-to-do parents. So, you know, that is very, if you're starting to see that discriminatory and that, you know, that piece starting to separate the society now when it comes to these vouchers and what it's doing to our neighborhoods and our families.
Right, thank you for that answer. I am going to sort of pick and choose some of these questions, as I would like to wrap up around 6:40. I know everyone has very busy lives to get to. So I'm going to ask one question from the registration form, which was, I know I spoke about the Hope Scholarship a couple, like 15 minutes ago. And that again is a bullying/harassment scholarship or like voucher, because they like to call them scholarships in private and religious schools to kind of mask what it really is, which is a voucher. So even I get caught up on that. The Hope Scholarship in 2021, I believe, Ron DeSantis did extend, yeah, it should be 2021, did extend the kind of parameters of harassment to include mask wearing in public schools, which was an essential and emergency situation that public schools had to go into. So do you think that the voucher system, both in Florida and beyond, has the opportunity to be like kind of exploited and misused? Although we talk about how the voucher system itself is problematic, do you think that, you know, that example, what does that kind of tell you about how easy it is sort of to do that? Maybe would like to answer.
Is it an opportunistic program? Yes, it is. You know, so every time that it moves in the favor of one of, you know, of an issue, you know, then they add that issue and add a topic and say, okay, so if it's not working, or if you don't want this, then we'll add this issue to the scholarship program, and you could move out of the public school system under the guidelines of this. Because bullying, you know, is, you know, for our kids, especially our LGBTQ students who get bullied all the time. So, you know, with the Hope Scholarship, it should have been helping those children. But let's be honest, when you have a child LGBT who doesn't qualify because the schools who take these vouchers discriminate against them, then there's a double standard. So it works for some and it eliminates others. So the hope for who is my question under the Hope Scholarship, basically.
Oh, I think you're still muted.
Sorry, just looking through the questions. So we have one from Anne Japalo. Why aren't transferred limited to semesters? So half the yearly amount pays for the first semester, and if the child transfers back, the second semester follows them. I guess, is it just a, like, is the child kind of given blank amount of money once a year? Is there any way to sort of nuance that? That way funding could come back to the school, or is that sort of just how it's always?
No, that's just how it is. I think that's done intentionally, you know, to see if they could keep the child out of the public school. But no, you know, the public schools have complained about this over and over and over again, but nothing changes.
Right. Nick, we have a question for you. This is from Gary Winfrey. I've read that private schools have better student outcomes. Is that true? I think you touched on it before, but I'd love if you could read.
Yeah, so I'm not going to pretend like there are no studies that say student outcomes improve when students choose a voucher. There are some that say that, but there are also some that say that student outcomes don't improve, that they stay the same. And there are some that say student outcomes actually get worse when students choose a voucher. In fact, there was a study of the Florida tax credit scholarship that found that students who used a voucher and then returned to public school afterwards performed worse on standardized tests than students who just stayed in public school. So if, you know, at the most generous level, the results are mixed. And to me, what that says is, then why are we doing this, right? The argument is that you're trying to give students a better education, and that's why we need vouchers, so we can send them to a better school to get better education. But the studies show that that's not happening. Sometimes it's improving a little bit, sometimes it's staying the same, sometimes it's getting worse. And when it's improving, it's not like it's improving 10 points, right? It's improving a few points. So is the harm to public schools that happen because you've taken away funding worth that small improvement? Is the violation of a religious freedom principle because you're paying for someone's religious education worth that? So anyone who says that the research unequivocally shows that outcomes improve is just wrong. That's not what the research shows.
All right, thank you. And we have another question probably for you, Nick, from Susan Artker. Has AU joined the lawsuit challenging House Bill 1557? The woman, are for both of you, also for Ms. Perez, the woman who said her daughter was supported, was inspiring. Step Up for Students is the worst. They get 3% commission and don't do anything for accountability. So I guess first question being, has AU joined the lawsuit against House Bill 1557?
We have not. So for those of you who don't know what that is, that's the parental rights bill. It's a very large bill. One of the issues in there is that students or parents have a fundamental right to direct their students' education as well as their religious upbringing, but there's a lot in there. We have not joined that. That is just kind of outside of our purview and expertise. And then, yeah, so Step Up for Students is the organization in Florida that administers the myriad voucher programs I think I saw a couple of questions about the types of voucher programs, but they do. So they just basically, they administer them because it was essentially a requirement to get around the law about vouchers before they got this current Supreme Court, where you have to create, instead of just having the state run them, you contract out to this other organization that runs them. So you give money to that organization, and then they actually give the money to the students. And so, yeah, they're allowed to keep a percentage. I don't know the percentage. 3% sounds right. I know other states, it's sometimes 5% or even higher. And their job generally is not accountability. It's just to administer the program. And so it, again, depends on the individual law about what they have to do with record keeping. So they'll have to do some kind of minimal record keeping. I don't know off the top of my head if any Florida voucher programs require audits or anything like that. But I do know that Step Up for Students would not be the one in charge of that. So yeah, they just basically are in charge of doling out the money.
Right. Thank you so much. I'm so sorry to sort of cut this short, but our wonderful, wonderful interpreter does have to go. We do have a couple more questions. I am going to, I can drop their emails if you'd like to ask them any more questions. I think the last one of them I can answer sort of the teacher licensure requirements in private schools. I'm pretty sure it's just not accountable to the way that public schools do. We talked about how teachers can come in unlicensed, and then our private schools allowed to completely opt out of standardized tests. I believe that they have their version. I know, for example, the FSA private schools in Florida do not have to take the Florida standardized test. I'm pretty sure that's kind of how it is in other states. I think they have to take a version of that, but I don't think it is the way.
What usually happens is, let's say you have to take like a national or norm reference test. So it's not the same tests. I don't know what they're called anymore. I think when I was still a high school student in Florida, it was like the exit exam. So it's not the same test, which means they get to say, oh, we're giving a test, but you can't actually use it to compare student outcomes because they're not taking the same exam. So that is another strategy of just how to make it seem like they're trying to have accountability, but not actually having any accountability.
Yes. And I just wanted to let everyone know, I'm going to be dropping a link in the chat. It's kind of our call to action. It's where you can email and talk to your reps and senators in your state, whether you're in Florida or beyond, to let them know that this is not something that you're a fan of, to promote not expanding it or to decrease it. So I think Alicia's going to drop that. And again, thank you so much, Jeremy. I think you left, but I wanted to thank everyone for being here today. I'm going to drop emails in the chat if there's any additional questions. I tried to get as many as we could. Yeah, I thank everybody for being here tonight. Thank you, Nick, and thank you, Karen. I really appreciated your expertise and your understanding and answering all of these questions. I know it was a lot. So thank you so much, everyone. And I just dropped 2 chats, and let me drop the link for, reaching out to your representatives. It's also available through AU. All right. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a great rest of your night, okay?
Thank you.
Thank you.